himself would send out the Air Force, the Army, the Marine Corps, and everybody and take us out.
The Bandidos gang is classified as a Tier 2 threat. That's the second highest level.
With only one motto, we are the people our parents warned us about. These are the 15 most dangerous bandidos in history. Number 15, Donald Chambers. Donald Eugene Chambers was a founding father of Bandidos, born on November 23, 1930. After serving in the United States Marine Corps during the Vietnam War, he returned to Texas and worked as a longshoreman. He had a passion for riding and had been a member of local clubs. Dissatisfied with the motorcycle clubs he joined, Chambers decided to form one of his own. On March 4, 1966, in San Leon, Texas, he founded the Bandidos Motorcycle Club. He named the club after Mexican bandits who lived by their own rules and chose red and gold as its colors, in honor of the Marine Corps. Recruitment began in biker bars across Houston and other nearby areas, and soon the Bandidos had over 100 members, many of whom were hardened Vietnam veterans. Not long after, Chambers was involved in a violent gunfight with a rival gang, with whom they had gathered to negotiate peace. Soon, the law enforcement was after him, and he had to relocate to New Mexico. By 1969, Chambers was on law enforcement's radar, but the darkest chapter of his life had yet to come. On December 22, 1972, Chambers and fellow Bandidos members abducted two drug dealer brothers. The brothers had tricked the Bandidos by selling them baking soda, claiming it was amphetamine. Seeking revenge, Chambers and his men drove them into the desert, forced them to dig their own graves, and then executed them. Their actions sent shockwaves even through the outlaw world. Chambers and his accomplices were convicted of the murders after testimony from a club prospect who had turned police informant. All three received life sentences. While Chambers was incarcerated, tragedy struck his family. In 1979, his 23-year-old son, Stephen Trammell Chambers, was shot dead during a nightclub dispute in Houston. The suspect fled, and decades later, in 2016, police arrested a man they thought was responsible, only to discover that the real killer had used a false identity. Chambers himself was paroled in 1983 after serving a decade behind bars. He stepped back from the Bandidos and eventually retired from the club altogether. He settled in El Paso, Texas, where he lived quietly until his death from cancer on July 18, 1999, at the age of 68. He was buried in Houston at Forest Park Lawndale Cemetery under a gravestone marked with his name, the Bandidos insignia, and a phrase that summed up the outlaw life he embraced. We are the people our parents warned us about. But when Donald Chambers was gone, the man who replaced him proved to be even more violent. Number 14. Ronnie Hodge. When Donald Chambers was behind the bars imprisoned, leadership of the Bandidos passed to Ronnie Hodge. He was ex-Marine who earned the nickname Mr. Prospect for patching into the club in just 1 month. Once elected national president, he styled himself Stepmother, a nod to Chambers' nickname Mother. Hodge was ruthless. He quickly reshaped the Bandidos by purging members he felt lacked true loyalty. Entire chapters in Montana and Indiana were shut down under his watch. Despite the cutbacks, the club thrived, replacing lost members with new recruits and expanding its reach. Then came 1978, and under Hodge's leadership, the Bandidos attended Bike Week in Daytona Beach for the first time. There, they struck a powerful alliance with the Outlaws Motorcycle Club, Florida's dominant gang. Drugs became the backbone of this relationship. The Outlaws supplied cocaine, while the Bandidos supplied meth. This partnership helped elevate the Bandidos into the ranks of the Big Four outlaw motorcycle clubs, the Banshees conflict. By 1983, tensions with the Banshees Motorcycle Club erupted. A violent clash in Texas left one Bandido and the Banshees president dead. The Bandidos were enraged that a much smaller club would dare to take them on, especially in Texas. Not only that, but several Banshees had once been Bandidos, defecting in what's called a patchover. At the funeral of fallen member John Batchelor, national leaders gathered. They couldn't allow the insult to go unanswered. Hodge ordered intelligence gathering on the Banshees chapters in Dallas and Texarkana and levied a $100 assessment from each Bandido to fund retaliation. Different avenues of revenge were explored. Possible attacks included drive-by shootings and bombings. Eventually, leaders approved a bombing operation against two Banshees residences in Dallas. The 1983 bombings, To provide cover for the bombers, the Bandidos staged 2 large parties, one in Rapid City, South Dakota, and another in Corpus Christi, Texas. On the 4th of July weekend in 1983, most members attended, creating perfect alibis for those who carried out the attacks. The party in Corpus Christi was well advertised and billed as a 4th of July poker run to raise money for the Cerebral Palsy Foundation, with the goal of helping the crippled children of Nueces County. One of the national officers was sent to Houston to obtain the explosives for bombs. He stole what he needed from the back of a truck carrying demolition supplies. They planted 2 bombs, one under a van at a Banshee house, another against the foundation of a second home. The first device exploded, damaging property but injuring no one. Hours later, the second bomb detonated when a Banshee leader tried to drive his van with his infant daughter inside. Miraculously, neither was seriously hurt. The botched attacks drew federal attention. In 1985, the DIA, ATF, and FBI launched a major roundup of Bandidos nationwide. During this period, Randy Hansen, one of the bombers and a trusted enforcer for the Nomads, defected. Afraid for his life, he cooperated with the DEA. Hansen's information proved invaluable. While undercover agents had focused on the Northwest, Hansen provided an insider's view of the Bandidos' Texas heartland. He revealed details of the bombings, weapons stockpiles, and safe houses. In 1986, the ATF raided Little Joe Benavides' home, seizing machine guns, explosives, narcotics, and equipment linked to the bombing plot. By 1988, federal authorities indicted 23 members and associates. Most were arrested within months, while charges were dropped against 6 for lack of evidence. Others pled guilty. The remaining defendants stood trial that December. 7 were convicted, including Ronnie Hodge, who, along with several top officers, received 5-year sentences. Law enforcement declared the convictions a major victory, publicly claiming it marked the end of the Bandidos as a criminal organization. Number 13, Richard Marla.
I've been in the inner circle. I've been in the circle, man.
Among the most dangerous figures tied to the Bandidos Motorcycle Club is Richard Stephen Marla, a man whose violent legacy still echoes in Texas outlaw history. Marla joined the Bandidos in the early 2000s and quickly became known for his willingness to kill. In late 2001, Bandidos Secretary Javier Negrete was gunned down outside Tiffany's Billiards in San Antonio. The club identified Robert Lara as the shooter, and retaliation followed. In 2002, Marla was awarded the notorious Expect No Mercy patch. It's only given to those who have committed violent acts for the club. Marla was unstoppable. In August 2004, during an argument, he fatally stabbed San Antonio boxing champion Robert Pekin Quiroga, the city's first world title holder. The killing shocked the community and drew national attention, forcing the Bandidos to publicly disown him, saying the killing was personal and not club business. Feeling abandoned and bitter, Marla later turned against the club while in prison. He testified in federal court about murders, drug trafficking, escort services, and other Bandidos operations. Testimony that prosecutors used to convict top leaders like John Xavier Portillo. Defense lawyers argued he was acting out of spite and revenge for being expelled, but his insider knowledge made him a powerful witness against the organization. Despite his testimony against his brothers, Marla was convicted of the killings and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. His testimony later became crucial in a federal racketeering case against the Bandidos' leadership, although defense attorneys claimed he was motivated by revenge after being expelled from the club. Richard Marla carried out his violence primarily on his own, but the men who came after him committed their crimes together, and what they did shocked an entire community. Number 12, Robert James Watson III. Robert Watson was the vice president of the Bandidos' Bellingham, Washington chapter. Inside the club, he carried real influence, but outside, his name would forever be linked to the Carriaga family murders. When fellow Bandidos asked if he was involved, his stories never matched. Even his own chapter president condemned the crime, insisting women and children were off limits. Yet suspicion pointed straight back to Bobby, remembered as the man who dragged the Bandidos' name into one of Washington's darkest massacres. Number 11, Johnny James Watson. Johnny Watson, Bobby's younger brother, was not a Bandido, but he was just as dangerous when it came to violence. The patch didn't bind him. Yet he joined his brother in carrying out the killings, proof that outlaw business can pull in even family members who live outside the club's rules. Number 10, Danny J. Kelly Jr. Kelly was a hang-around prospect for the Bandidos, with Bobby Watson sponsoring his membership. Once, he had been close to Johnny Cariaga, so close that he stood as best man at his wedding. But when Johnny accused him of theft, the friendship ended bitterly. That betrayal became the seed of murder, with Kelly choosing loyalty to the outlaw world over his former friend. The Cariaga family murders.
Kids up 911 reporting.
My whole family shot me too. We're shot right now. My family's dead.
The 911 call came from a 16-year-old boy in the Cariaga family, bleeding from gunshot wounds. He somehow found the strength to dial for help, but soon, the killer realized the boy had called 911 and then did the unthinkable.
When the killers heard him make that call, they put a pillow against his head. Then they set the Cariaga home on and disappeared into the night.
3 family members were shot dead, and their father, Johnny Cariaga, who owned a restaurant, was taken alive. Days later, his burned body was discovered in his truck, abandoned on a rural property. Investigators learned Johnny Cariaga wasn't just a restaurant owner. He was deeply tied to drug trafficking. He moved cocaine up from California, stashed tens of thousands in cash. He was taking supplies from Bandidos. But when his connections soured, the supplier turned against him. The motive was rooted in betrayal. The case stretched on for years. But in 2024, justice finally served. Bobby Watson, Johnny Watson, and Danny J. Kelly Jr. were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Cariaga murders showed how outlaw violence could wipe out a family. But in 1972, the Bandidos set their sights on a National Guard sergeant and marked him for death. Number 9, Jimmy R. Graves. Jimmy R. Graves, a member of the Bandidos Dallas chapter, became one of the earliest examples of just how far the club would go to protect its own. Jimmy's story is tied to the cold-blooded murder of a National Guard sergeant. It was a killing that shook Texas in the early 1970s. In March 1972, Charles Edwin Overfield, a 29-year-old father and National Guard sergeant, was preparing to testify against Robert Powell, a Bandidos associate. Powell had been charged with trying to burglarize a National Guard armory in Louisiana, hoping to steal weapons, and later attempting to bribe a witness. Overfield's testimony would have sealed Powell's fate and, in the process, exposed dangerous links between the Bandidos and organized crime. The club couldn't allow that. Overfield became a target. On March 9, 1972, as he traveled Interstate 20 near the Texas-Louisiana border, Overfield was ambushed. Gunfire tore through his vehicle, killing him instantly. It was a contract hit, carried out on orders meant to silence him forever. The message was clear. Testifying against the Bandidos could cost you your life. Jimmy always denied the allegation.
How long do you think the Bandidos motorcycle organization would last if we went out shooting?
Investigators quickly pieced together the chain of responsibility. A few months later, in July 1972, Graves pleaded guilty to the murder. The court sentenced him to life in prison. Jimmy R. Graves demonstrated that from the outset, the Bandidos were willing to go after law enforcement. But decades later, the club's power reached an even higher level under a man who became its most notorious president. Number 8, J. Jeffrey Fay Pike, better known as Jeff Pike, was born in Northern California in the late 1950s. He dropped out of high school and by the early 1970s had relocated to Texas. Pike worked ordinary jobs, dishwasher, cook, and home builder. But his life changed in 1979 when he joined the Bandidos Motorcycle Club. From the beginning, Pike stood out. He was ambitious and strategic, and he rose steadily through the ranks. By the mid-2000s, he reached the pinnacle of power, becoming national president of the Bandidos. Under his leadership, the club grew stronger, expanding its territory and deepening its involvement in criminal enterprises while competing against rivals like the Cossacks. But on May 17, 2015, under Pike's presidency, the biggest arrest of a biker gang happened in Waco, Texas. What began as a biker gathering turned into chaos when the Bandidos and rival Cossacks clashed in a crowded restaurant parking lot. By the end of the brawl, 9 bikers were dead, more than a dozen were wounded, and 177 arrests were made. Pike wasn't physically present, but prosecutors argued that the shootout reflected the violent culture he fostered at the top of the Bandidos' hierarchy. The Waco massacre was only one chapter of Pike's criminal legacy. In 2016, federal authorities indicted him on charges of racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, assault, and drug trafficking.
Breaking developments in the federal case against a notorious motorcycle club leader. Jeffrey Pike just appeared in front of a judge on several charges, and we've learned he allegedly called for members to commit murder.
Among the most serious allegations was his role in the 2006 assassination of Anthony Benesch, a man who had tried to start a Hells Angels chapter in Austin. Prosecutors portrayed Pike not as a distant figurehead, but as a man who approved and directed violence. In May 2018, after a lengthy federal trial in San Antonio, Pike was convicted of racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, assault, and firearms charges. He was sentenced to life in prison. While Jeffrey Fay Pike was the national president, he did not run the empire alone. At his side was the national vice president, who was just as ruthless and often pulled the strings on the ground. Number 7. John Xavier Portillo. John Xavier Portillo rose through the Bandidos ranks to become national vice president, standing shoulder to shoulder with national president Jeffrey Fay Pike. Together, they ran the club at its most violent peak. He was the man who authorized violence, drug trafficking, and intimidation. One of the most infamous cases linked to him was the 2006 killing of Anthony Benesch, who was shot outside a restaurant in Austin after attempting to start a Hells Angels chapter. Portillo's name also surfaced in connection with the 2002 death of Robert Lara, which came after Lara was accused of killing Bandidos secretary Javier Negrete. In May 2018, after a 3-month federal trial in San Antonio, Portillo was convicted alongside Pike on charges of racketeering, murder conspiracy, drug trafficking, assaults, and firearms violations. The courtroom evidence pulled back the curtain, exposing the Bandidos as a structured criminal enterprise where violence was as routine as business.
The verdict is now in. 2 top former Bandidos, National President Jeffrey Fay Pike and ex-Vice President John Xavier Portillo, found guilty in a 13-count indictment.
By September 2018, the sentence came down. 2 consecutive life terms plus 20 years in federal prison. He was also forced to forfeit firearms, a motorcycle, and cash seized from his home. For Portillo, once one of the most feared men in Texas outlaw circles, the empire was finished. As Portillo's reign came to an end in the courtroom, a new generation of Bandidos was already making headlines on the streets. Number 6. Chris Jake Carrizal. Christopher Jake Carrizal is one of the most recognizable figures in Bandidos history, remembered as the president of the Dallas chapter during the infamous Twin Peaks shootout in Waco, Texas. On May 17, 2015, tensions between the Bandidos and their rivals, the Cossacks, exploded outside a Twin Peaks restaurant. What began as a standoff escalated into an all-out gunfight in a crowded parking lot. By the time the smoke cleared, 9 bikers were dead, more than a dozen others were wounded, and 177 people were arrested. It remains the deadliest biker shootout in U.S. history. Carrizal quickly became the central figure of the case. As Dallas chapter president, he bore responsibility for leading his men into the bloodbath. On the trial, Carrizal admitted firing his gun but claimed it was in self-defense, testifying that a Cossack tried to attack him through his helmet. He also described watching his father, himself a Bandido, take a bullet to the shoulder during the melee. Despite the chaos and scale of the bloodshed, the trial against Carrizal ended in a mistrial, with jurors deadlocked. In the aftermath, all charges against the 177 bikers were dropped. The inability to secure convictions turned the Waco case into one of the most controversial failures in American criminal justice. For a while, Carrizal faded from headlines, but in May 2024, his name returned. Police say Carrizal and fellow Bandido Eric Grindstaff revved their motorcycles outside a Dallas man's home after midnight. When confronted, they allegedly kicked in the man's door, threatened to kill him, and Carrizal pointed a handgun through the glass. Both men, wearing Bandidos vests, were arrested and charged with aggravated assault and later released on bond. Carrizal's name will always be tied to the chaos of Waco, but not long before that, another Bandido president was making headlines of his own. Number 5. Howard Wayne Baker. Howard Wayne Baker served as the president of the Fort Worth chapter of the Bandidos Motorcycle Club. Under his leadership, the chapter operated less like a social club and more like a criminal crew capable of orchestrated violence. In December 2014, dozens of Bandidos stormed rivals the Ghost Riders, the Cossacks, and Wino's crew. Shockingly, Baker stood inside the lethal circle, directing the attack. Jeffrey Brady, a 41-year-old Ghost Rider, was dragged outside and executed in front of his wife and friends. 2 others were wounded before the Bandidos fled. At Baker's trial in 2017, prosecutors argued that he didn't need to pull the trigger himself. But under Texas's law of parties, evidence showed Baker stormed the bar, contained Brady, and orchestrated the chaos. The jury deliberated for less than a day before finding him guilty of murder, aggravated assault, engaging in organized crime, and directing a street gang. In June 2017, Baker was sentenced to 45 years in prison for murder, with other charges merged or running concurrently. The message was clear. In Texas, leading a chapter also meant carrying the weight of its crimes. While Howard Wayne Baker showed how a Bandido president could orchestrate violence on a large scale, the next member revealed how even rank-and-file members carried the same code of intimidation. His story unfolded not in a bar or on the streets, but in the aisles of a grocery store, where a simple encounter turned into a deadly threat. Number 4. Albert De Leon. Albert De Leon, a 45-year-old Bandido from San Antonio, proved how far loyalty to the outlaw code can go. In May 2019, he pleaded guilty to retaliation after threatening a former Bandido who had turned government informant. It was the same man whose testimony had helped convict National President Jeffrey Fay Pike and Vice President John Xavier Portillo. The confrontation unfolded on February 22, 2019, inside an ordinary H-E-B grocery store in San Antonio. Then De Leon spotted the man he blamed for bringing down the Bandidos' leadership. He walked straight toward him, pulled a pistol from his waistband, cocked it, and delivered a chilling warning. "You're going to die today. You're a snitch. Jeff and John went down because of you." For a moment, the store froze. Although De Leon tucked the pistol away before walking off, the damage was done. It wasn't just a threat, it was a message to every potential informant that betrayal of the Bandidos came with consequences. In September 2019, Judge Fred Beery sentenced De Leon to 30 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervision. Prosecutors were clear. His actions weren't just about personal anger. They were about enforcing the Bandidos' code of silence, ensuring loyalty through fear. That moment in a grocery store showed how far even ordinary members would go to defend the club's code of silence. But the next story is about someone very different, a man who came from reality television before stepping into the outlaw world. Number 3. Brandon Hance. Brandon Hance was once known as a contestant on the reality show Survivor, but his life took a darker turn when he joined the Bandidos Motorcycle Club. Taking on the names Loco and Gun Drop, he quickly found himself entangled in violent clashes. In February 2023, prosecutors say Hance took part in a brutal assault on members of the Graybeards Motorcycle Club. He allegedly stood guard at the entrance of Bimbaw's bar, trapping Graybeards inside while fellow Bandidos carried out the beating. Their jackets were stolen. It was a calculated act of humiliation in biker culture. By December 2023, authorities claim Hance was involved in setting fire to the County Line Ice House, a Montgomery County bar that had hosted an event for rival club Brothers East. Witnesses, informants, and cell phone data tied him to the arson. Even though surveillance cameras failed to clearly identify the attackers, Hance's time with the Bandidos was brief. He was with the club for less than 2 years. His wife Erica testified in court that he quit the club in July 2024 after becoming disillusioned. The Bandidos placed a green light on him, effectively sanctioning other members to target him. Since then, Hance has spoken openly in interviews and on social media about his regret in ever joining the club. His lawyer told the court that his public criticism, combined with his exit, brought death threats against him and his family. Despite lacking a prior criminal record, federal prosecutors argue Hance played a role in organized violence. In February 2025, he was indicted on racketeering and arson charges, offenses carrying the possibility of decades behind bars. Brandon Hance showed how even brief members could cause chaos. But years earlier, the Bandidos' expansion overseas would ignite one of the bloodiest biker wars in history. Number 2. Anthony Spencer Snodgrass. Anthony Mark Spencer's life began in tragedy. Born into a broken home in Sydney, he never even knew if the name he carried was his actual birth name. His childhood was spent bouncing through various foster care placements. His father was absent, and his mother, who struggled with mental illness, ultimately took her own life. As a child in an Anglican boys' home, Spencer endured cruelty from other boys who once tried to drown him in a bathtub. Though he survived, the incident left him with a lifelong fear of water. Barely literate, Spencer poured his emotions into a diary filled with spelling mistakes. A private outlet for a boy who grew up lonely, rejected, and desperate for love. Drifting from one place to another, he finally found his place in the Comancheros Motorcycle Club. By the early 1980s, Australia's outlaw motorcycle scene was changing rapidly. The Comancheros Motorcycle Club had split into two factions, the city chapter, led by Anthony Snodgrass Spencer, and the Parramatta chapter, controlled by National President William Jock Ross. Ross had begun transforming the club into a paramilitary-style organization, but Spencer rejected the new direction. He wanted to live the biker life, not march like a soldier. In 1983, Spencer and his faction formally split from the Comancheros. They burned their colors in a symbolic act of rebellion and sought recognition from the Bandidos Motorcycle Club in the United States. The Americans approved, and the first Australian Bandidos chapter was born in Sydney. The move enraged Ross and the remaining Comancheros, who viewed it as both treachery and an American invasion. From that moment, tensions spiraled. Both clubs fought for dominance, not just against each other, but also against other outlaw gangs, such as the Hells Angels and the Rebels. The conflicts escalated into full-blown war in August 1984, after a heated phone call between Spencer and Ross effectively declared open hostilities. On September 2, 1984, Father's Day in Australia, the British Motorcycle Club hosted a family-friendly swap meet at the Viking Tavern in Milperra, a suburb of Sydney. It was meant to be a community event, complete with food, music, and families with children. But the simmering war between the Comancheros and the newly formed Bandidos was about to boil over. That morning, Bandidos confronted Comanchero member Glenn Eves, challenging him to a confrontation. The confrontation happened in a parking lot, and both parties arrived armed. Both sides lined up, staring each other down across the lot. At the height of the standoff, Comanchero leader Jock Ross waved a machete and gave the order, "Kill 'em all!" The parking lot erupted into chaos. In less than 10 minutes, the battle left 7 people dead, 4 Comancheros, 2 Bandidos, and a 14-year-old girl. Police were called. Over 200 officers reached the scene, but it was too late. 20 others were wounded. The brutal confrontation would forever be remembered as the Milperra Massacre. The massacre made international headlines. It was proof that the Bandidos were now a force in Australia. Rumors spread in the aftermath, including a false theory that the young girl killed was not actually Leanne Walters, but another girl carrying her ID. Dental records later confirmed her identity, putting those rumors to rest. The Milperra Massacre cemented Anthony Snodgrass Spencer's place in outlaw history. A man shaped by a tragic childhood had risen to lead Australia's first Bandidos chapter, sparking one of the bloodiest biker wars the country had ever seen. His decisions on that Father's Day left a legacy written in blood, marking the Bandidos' arrival on the global outlaw stage. The Milperra Massacre showed just how violent the Bandidos' arrival in Australia could be. But years later, another figure would rise from the same scene, a feared enforcer whose reputation was built on surviving ambushes and carrying out brutal orders. Number 1. Toby Mitchell. Toby Mitchell's name became synonymous with outlaw violence in Australia. A former kickboxer and nightclub identity, he eventually rose to one of the most feared positions in the Bandidos Motorcycle Club, Sergeant at Arms of the Victorian chapter. His reputation was built on fear and violence. In 2011, Mitchell survived an ambush outside a gym near the Bandidos Brunswick clubhouse. Hit by 6 bullets, he lost a kidney, gallbladder, and much of his liver. But he lived, and his survival only added to his legend. Less than 2 years later, in 2013, he was shot again, this time in the arm as he entered the clubhouse of the Diablos, a Bandidos support club. The attack was never solved, but it cemented his image as a marked man in Australia's biker wars. By 2013, Mitchell stepped away from the Bandidos, citing health issues and growing disputes. He was arrested multiple times for assaults, public brawls, and affrays. Though no longer wearing the red and gold patch, His reputation as the Bandidos' former enforcer followed him everywhere. Mitchell later joined the Mongols Motorcycle Club, showing how shifting allegiances in Australia's biker scene often reignite old rivalries. His social media presence and celebrity status made him one of the most public outlaw bikers in the country and one of the most polarizing. The Bandidos' history is a tale of blood, loyalty, and power. Many of their leaders are now serving life sentences. Others are buried, but the shadow of the red and gold patch still lingers on the outlaw road. But this is only one part of the outlaw world. Click on the next video to see how a giant of the biker scene, a man feared the most, not because of his weapons, but because of his fist.